The Canal Zone in Brussels, a former industrial belt surrounded by working-class districts, a prime example of European gentrification. High-income lofts, an upcoming giant glossy museum, sterile public space, cultural hub for entrepreneurs. Generic high-rise towers is just a little part of the gentrification scenario.
Well, was there any alternative?
Of course, absolutely, yes, there was. There were countless alternatives, but they deliberately chose the gentrification scenario.
Who do you mean by they, man?
Well, if you want to know who are they, stay tuned and you will know. You're watching Stripping Architecture, and in this episode, we'll be exploring together a very interesting case study about gentrification and how this process has totally ignored the creative and community-led alternatives.
This is the story of how a city got it wrong. A story of how powerful elites dismiss visionary ideas in favor of capital. A story revealing how capitalist logics imposed on urban space doesn't stimulate innovation. On the contrary, it creates dull, predictable, profit-driven environments tailored to the affluent. If you want to hear about inspiring counter-strategies to gentrification and how to build affordable, accessible cities, this is a story for you.
Ten years ago, during our studies in Brussels, the Canal Zone was one of the hottest topics in urban development in Brussels.
Think tanks, universities, NGOs, and creative collectives developed dozens of intriguing concepts worth evaluating, but all of it was discarded, ignored. Bottom-up thinking was pushed aside, and once again, the top-down decision-making was implemented, the design logic that is favored by capitalism. The government and the private sector choose to abandon the working class and pursue business interests instead of developing socially cohesive and economically resilient city.
Before we dive in the urban creative strategies and the brutal gentrification process, let's briefly describe the Canal Zone.
The canal area of Brussels, once the productive heart of Belgium, with factories, warehouses, and dock labor that were powered by migrant workers who were brought through work visa programs, were successfully feeding the urban growth. The largest municipalities bordering the canal are Molenbeek and Anderlecht, municipalities built on the lives of the working class households.
The industrial heritage is still carved in the memory of the neighborhood. Small terraced workers' houses, streets named after the coal miners or the coal mines, and former factories are part of the industrial urban codes.
From the 1960s onwards, deindustrialization was in the beginning. Belgium, a founding member of the European Economic Community, gradually pushed industry outwards to reshape Brussels into a city image, representative and attractive for the global eye. Motorway infrastructure facilitated imports and globalized supply chains, accelerated the decline of local production. Brusselization, driven by speculative development and commercialization of land, priced factories out. Belgium shed its productive base and embraced the fire economy.
Yes, finance, insurance, real estate, fire economy, money made from commissions, fees, and rent. Making more money actually without any productive activity. Magical, isn't it? It sounded clean and modern. Wealth without smoke, factories, and reunions. But as Matthew van Griekingen noted in his book Against Gentrification, almost 120,000 jobs from a working class has vanished in a very short period of time.
Progress mattered. People didn't. No transition plan, no safety net. Just a silent revolution that enriched the privileged. As Brussels grew into the administrative heart of Europe, policy increasingly catered to the skilled international workers. The working class did not disappear, it was simply recast as a service class. The neighborhoods along the canal were left behind, de-invested, forgotten, ignored. But capital must expand. When land becomes scarce elsewhere, attention returned to the canal. This area was ready for re-evaluation, a chance for community-led renewal. Universities and civic actors rushed to contribute. Students talk to residents, map needs, and document informal economies. There are so many interesting findings: bakeries, repair workshops, micro-import-export firms, hardware suppliers, businesses that anchored community life and resilience after the industrialization period. A universe of invisible life. There were challenges: cramped housing, limited open spaces, poor mobility, but momentum existed. People had ideas, energy, and networks. The think tank organizations such as Architecture Workroom documented economically and socially vibrant local industries, arguing that cities need productive work. Activist organizations such as BRAL advocated co-locating housing with workplaces, a double force that keeps neighborhoods alive. Can you imagine the power of that idea? Affordable housing built alongside workshops and studios. Live near your job and 10 minutes away from the city center. Nice. A self-sustaining neighborhood, equitable, diverse, and vibrant. This could have been the model for a new kind of European city, not reliant on endless debt, but powered by local productivity. In 2012 and 2013, the educational institutions such as ULB and Erasmus organized the master classes Rework, an End of Line, about the existence of homes and space for industry, logistics, or infrastructure on various key sites in Brussels. In 2014, the think tank Architecture Workroom, the Citizens Association BRAL, and the Flemish Network for a Sustainable Environment Bond Beter Leef Milieu launched a manifesto-type text, Productive Brussels, about how Brussels and its metropolitan suburbs could be developed as a single economic urban system. The enthusiasm was so strong that the Brussels city architect Christian Boret publicly and officially adopted the concept. His manifesto stated the following introduction, open quote, "In recent years, European cities have been transforming post-industrial wastelands into attractive new urban districts. Remarkable projects have led to successful urban regeneration. But at the same time, functions such as production, manufacturing, food supply, maintenance, and repair have been pushed out of the city. Yet, productive activity is an integral part of the city. If we want the city to become a sustainable and resilient metabolism, it must be more than just a place for consumption. If we want to maintain and facilitate the integration of production in the city, we need to invent new urban typologies that combine housing and productive activity and offer them visibility in the public space." Such a great words, right? Isn't this exciting and refreshing? Discussions were already underway about how to develop decent, even beautiful social housing that could self-fund through nearby productive activities and support vibrant community life. Debates pushed even further. How could we acquire land around productive zones through community land trusts? How could we design neighborhoods where density and smart configuration create better living conditions? How could we build more dense but humane social housing, lower the construction cost per unit, and free up more space for workshops and work environments? One of the suggestions were to explore concepts like vertical factories. You should definitely check out Nina Rappaport's book on the topic if you're interested. We participated in a workshop imagining mixed-use buildings, housing fused with light industry and factories. Truly innovative design inspired by people on the ground. Transport was also rethought. We attended on debates about making certain tram and metro lines free during peak hours, reopening water transport along the canal, and turning it into a genuine mobility backbone. There are proposals to use flea markets as urban anchors, expand urban farming, support training for skilled workers, strengthen second-hand economies, combine daycare with shared workspace, experiment with housing cooperatives, new methods for financing housing with taxation of commercial transactions, new methods of ownership, inducing housing affordability by forming maintenance cooperatives, urban mining.
Look, there were plenty of good ideas on the table. Well, actually, talking about ideas, what about having a look on our nice book? The Urban Revolution is a fun sketch. It has loads of ideas and urban inspirations in multiple case studies around. It will strengthen your immunity, and for sure it will weaponize you with very concrete and strong, deep insight for urban issues. Check the link down, and don't forget, it's to buy it and support our work. Back to the Canal Zone. Why none of the creative ideas were not implemented? The answer is simple: the Canal Plan.
If we go back a bit in the manifesto introduced by the city architect of Brussels, a little bit further down, we can read the following sentence. This desire to keep productive activities in the city has been on the Brussels political agenda for several years, thanks in particular to the Canal Plan.
The key word of this sentence is the Canal Plan. The Canal Plan was presented as a bold, visionary, creative solution for Brussels' political agenda. But behind this polished language, there was no real attention to give a shot for a bottom-up development.
Instead, the plan worked to stigmatize the area, sell land to private developers, and create a shiny new canal district that matched the branding slogan, Brussels, capital of Europe. This strategy, treating the neighborhood as an urban desert waiting to be filled with gentrification, is best captured in the book Against the Gentrification by Mathieu van Krickinge. He describes how almost overnight, authorities in close collaboration with the private sector have hired a foreign urbanist to draw up a master plan for the Canal Zone, bypassing local voices and expertise. Check this quote from the book. Open quote. Brussels, 2014. I'm attending a lecture given by an internationally renowned architect, an urban planner commissioned by the Brussels government to develop a vision and an operational approach for the redevelopment of the neighborhoods located on the either side of the canal that runs through the city center. The lecture is being held in an amphitheater at the business school attached to the university where I work. For just over an hour, the speaker presents plans, photos, and sketches showcasing the results of his work. The images depicting the existing state of the analyzed space evoke sometimes banality, sometimes drabness, sometimes neglect. The evocations of the envisioned future, on the other hand, are invariably sunny, verdant, almost cheerful in his speech. The speaker makes numerous references to themes such as the quality of the city, the diversity of its populations, the variety of its functions, and the openness of its spaces. One theme in particular recurs frequently: the potential of this space, which the speaker considers both enormous, underutilized, and poorly showcased. A few months earlier, when he began his expert assessment, he had already stated in the press that the canal area is not worthy of Brussels. This is just a small paragraph where Mathieu in his book Against the Gentrification explains how the canal was primed for gentrification, ignoring all creative ideas. Officials were not interested in creative or participatory design, nor in long-term prosperity for residents. What they wanted was quick revenue, acquisition taxes, profitable land transactions, and the appearance of economic dynamism. Above all, the plan was class-blind, crafted by officials and the private sector in true neoliberal fashion, prioritizing fast business deals over people. And the outcome was immediate. Within days of the announcement, developers sensed opportunity. Speculation surged. Lawyers, lobbyists, and brokers mobilized. Real estate companies sharpened their teeth for the hunt. The Canal Zone transformed into a free market safari for the wealthy. Hedge funds, private equity, venture capital, and developers fighting over prime land. Meanwhile, working-class residents were forgotten. Community-driven proposals were discarded. Today, the Canal Zone is being rapidly gentrified. Rents are rising, people are being pushed out, and not a single meaningful social housing project has been built along key stretches of the waterways. Once again, the working class is asked to believe the neoliberal promise. Don't worry, wealth will trickle down to everyone. We know it doesn't. We've watched this model fail around the world over and over again. It's time for a different approach. And as always, let's wrap up this video with a city secret sketch. In this illustration, we can see familiar urban qualities: a monumental church as the focal point and a water element anchoring the space. These are standard urban markers that signal centrality, a city center or a historical urban core. Under neoliberal policies and rent-seeking logics, we have been conditioned to envision these sites, especially city centers, primarily as tourist attractions or as urban cores frozen in space and time. To a certain extent, preservation is important, but too often we put all our eggs in one basket, hoping that rents alone will save our cities. With this illustration, we imagine something different. Instead of fast plazas, empty open spaces, and endless restaurants, we want to provoke a shift in thinking towards degentrification. Around the monumental church, we illustrate diverse residential housing, social housing, flea markets, and productive urban spaces. These are places and functions that sustain everyday life, resources for working-class communities who in reality keep the city running. Through this sketch, we invite you to think differently. City centers and historical sites should not exist only for tourism. We should recognize as a strength the possibility of having productive, workable spaces right in the urban core. This perspective can push the conversation forward on how to build more resilient cities. As you may already know, we end every video with this type of illustration, our City Secrets sketch. These sketches are later transformed into collectible cards. If you'd like to check them out and become a collector with inspiring urban knowledge, follow the link below, join our Patreon, and support our work. Thank you. Well, that was it for today. Hopefully, we managed to deliver some new information. If you have similar study cases from your city, please share it with us. And don't forget to get our book, The Urban Revolution is a Fun Sketch. Don't forget to subscribe to our Patreon and order these cards. Become collector of super nice knowledge, urban knowledge, packed in your pockets. And let's start seeding the urban revolution with tiny little fun sketches. Like, subscribe, share, spread a lot of love, and observe and think about your city with a very critical eye. Strip it naked and see what's behind the buildings. Bye-bye.